Good evening. Today I'm going to talk about Chapter 30, American Life in the Roaring Twenties, 1920 to 1932. Just so you realize, this is a chapter that has combined two previous chapters in the 16th edition. American Life in the Roaring Twenties also includes Politics of Boom and Bust, that was another chapter in the 16th edition. Disillusioned by war and peace, Americans in the 1920s denounced radical foreign ideas, condemned un American lifestyles, shunned diplomatic commitments to foreign countries, and restricted immigration. This chapter covers the presidency of three conservative Republican presidents, Warren Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover, who steered the United States on a roller coaster ride of the 1920s, a thrilling ascent from the depths of post-World War I recession to breathtaking economic prosperity, followed by a terrifying crash into the Great Depression. At the same time, the United States retreated from a brief period of internationalism during World War I and returned with a vengeance to its traditional foreign policy of military unpreparedness and political isolationism. Henry Ford's most distinctive contribution to the automobile industry was the production of standardized, relatively inexpensive automobiles due to the perfection of the assembly line. Before the automobile, the steel industry dominated the American economy. But during the 1920s, employing directly or indirectly about 6 million people by 1930, the automobile industry was a major wellspring of the nation's prosperity. Thousands of new jobs emerged in supporting industries including rubber, glass, fabrics, oil production, and refining, as well as highway construction and thousands of service stations and garages. Diets improved as perishable fresh fruits and vegetables could now be speedily brought from farm to table on the newly paved roads that ribboned across the land, often paid for by taxes on gasoline. Lured by sophisticated advertising and encouraged by tempting installment plan buying, countless Americans with modest paychecks acquired the habit of riding as they paid. By the late 1920s, Americans owned more automobiles than bathtubs. "I can't go to town in a bathtub," one homemaker explained. The automobile revolution resulted in the consolidation of schools, the spread of suburbs, a loss of population in less attractive states like the Dakotas, North and South, increased highway construction, and altered youthful sexual behavior. In the last edition, the book talked about car advertisements that reached out to women by showing them cars were respectable for women, linking modern independent women to automobiles, noting that cars enabled women to better fulfill their roles as household managers, and demonstrating that women could indeed learn to drive. The mass production of automobiles in the 1920s led to the growth of the petroleum industry, suburban communities, installment buying, and lifestyle changes. One of the primary social effects of the new automobile age was a weakening of traditional family ties between parents and youth. The car enabled youth to escape parental supervision in a way not previously possible. And one American judge basically described cars as prostitution houses on wheels. The reality is, it's only because of the internal combustion engine that we have automobiles being able to produce in mass numbers. Another application of the internal combustion engine was to air flight. The primary reason for the American public's adulation of Charles Lindbergh after his solo transatlantic flight in May 1927 was that he combined a mastery of new technology with the traditional American virtues of individualism and hard work. Charles Lindbergh's solo flight across the Atlantic made him an American hero, especially because his wholesome youthfulness contrasted with the cynicism and debunking of the jazz age. The U.S. airline industry in the 1920s made most of its early profits through mail contracts with the federal government. With the advent of radio and motion pictures, much of the rich diversity of immigrant culture was lost. The American radio industry was distinctive from radio in European nations because it was commercialized business dependent upon advertising. Radios and movies both had the cultural effect of increasing standardized mass culture and weakening traditional forms of family and neighborhood culture. Automobiles, radios, and motion pictures contributed to the standardization of American life. The changing role of professional sports in American life during the 1920s was that it became increasingly commercialized in live radio broadcasts and newsreel formats. The most influential classical film of the 1910s was D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation, that stirred extensive protests by African Americans because the film glorified the Ku Klux Klan and portrayed blacks as corrupt politicians or rapists. The premiere of the film The Birth of a Nation in 1915 was most responsible for sparking the revival of the Ku Klux Klan in the early 20th century. And the first talking motion picture was Jazz Singer. So movies were mass culture spreading common values and attitudes throughout the country. The rapid expansion of capital, increasing productivity of workers, perfection of the assembly line production, and advertising and credit buying all made possible the prosperity of the 1920s. The economic boom of the 1920s greatly raised the incomes and living standards of many Americans, but the prosperity that developed in the 1920s helped to accumulate a cloud of debt. The exception to the economic boom of the 1920s was the chronic trouble experienced by American culture based on the fact that after 1920, 2 years after the end of World War I, European countries resumed normal agricultural production and were no longer eager to import American farm products. So the main problem faced by American manufacturers in the 1920s involved developing an expanded market of people to buy their products. So the most innovative features of the Jazz Age economy was mass advertising and installment buying. To awaken customers' desire for products that were not necessities of life, the advertising industry preyed on people's insecurities about their status or physical appearance, just like TV commercials do today. Margaret Sanger was most noted for her advocacy of birth control. In the 1920s, the major changes pursued by American women were cultural freedom and expanded sexual experience. Among the major, to justify their sexual frankness, many Americans pointed to the theories of Sigmund Freud. Jazz music was developed by American blacks, and in the 1920s, jazz served as an outlet for blacks' expression of dissent and opposition to white values. A new racial pride also blossomed in the northern black communities that grew during and after the World War I. New York's Harlem neighborhood counted over 150,000 African American residents in the 1920s. They sustained a vibrant, creative cultures that nourished poets like Langston Hughes, whose first volume of verses, The Weary Blues, appeared in 1926. Marcus Garvey, founder of the United Negro Improvement Association, a man who immigrated from Jamaica, promoted the resettlement of American blacks in Africa, inspired strong feelings of self-confidence and self-reliance among blacks, was convicted of mail fraud and deported by the U.S. government, and sponsored many black-owned businesses that included a passenger liner company. The primary achievement of Marcus Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association was its positive impact on black racial pride. The Red Scare of the early 1920s was initially set off by the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. The Red Scare of 1919-1920 was provoked by the public's fear that labor troubles were sparked by communist and anarchist revolutionaries. Business people used the Red Scare to break the backs of fledgling unions, and during the Red Scare, hundreds of Soviet radicals were deported from the United States, 246 of them. Many states passed laws making it a crime to advocate violence, and 5 socialists, though duly elected, were denied their seats in the New York State Legislature. The Sacco-Vanzetti case, Scopes trial, resurgence of the KKK, or Ku Klux Klan, the Immigration Act of 1924, and the deportation of radicals to Russia were all indicative of the post-war anxiety and intolerance of Americans in the 1920s. Besides attacking minorities like Catholics, blacks, and Jews, the Ku Klux Klan of the 1920s opposed contemporary cultural and social changes such as evolution as birth control. With 5 million members at its peak in the 1920s, the KKK was known for secret rituals, flag-waving parades, the blazing cross, and the bloodied lash. The Ku Klux Klan of the 1920s was a reaction against the forces of diversity and modernity that were transforming American culture. But the KKK will virtually collapse in the late 1920s when the organization was publicly exposed as a corrupt and cynical racket. Also, immigration restrictions of the 1920s were introduced as a result of the nativists' belief that Northern Europeans were superior to Southern and Eastern Europeans who had olive skin, who were not white, and were either Roman Catholic, Jewish, or Eastern Orthodox. The quota system established for immigration in the 1920s was based partly on the idea that immigrants from Northern and Western Europe were superior to those from Southern and Eastern Europe. This was manifested in the congressional law passed as the Immigration Act of 1924 that was formulated to impose immigration quotas based on nationality, effectively shut the door against virtually all Asian and Arabs, and discriminated directly against Southern and Eastern Europeans as well as the Japanese. Cultural pluralists like Horace Kallen and Randolph Bourne generally advocated that immigrants should be able to retain their traditional cultures rather than blend into a single American melting pot. One exception was the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924 that granted citizenship to all Native Americans born in the United States, though it stopped short of guaranteeing voting rights which were governed by state law. To achieve class and political solidarity, immigrant workers primarily had to overcome ethnic diversity. The concentration of many American ethnic groups in separate neighborhoods with their own distinct institutions, cultures, and values meant that it was almost impossible to organize the American working class across ethnic and religious lines. During the 1920s and after, many American immigrant ethnic groups lived in neighborhoods with their own churches or synagogues, newspapers, and theaters where they attempted to retain their own world culture. One example were the Polish. Many Polish peasants learned about America from agents from U.S. railroads, letters from friends and relatives, agents from steamship lines, and Polish-American business people. The enforcement of the Volstead Act met the strongest resistance from big city residents and immigrant groups. Although speakeasies and hard liquor flourished, historians argued that prohibition was not entirely a failure because bank savings increased, absenteeism in the workplace decreased, people consumed less alcohol overall, and more people lived a sober lifestyle. But one clear result or major impact of prohibition was a rise in criminal organizations that supplied illegal liquor. Among the consequences of prohibition was a growing cultural conflict between urban immigrants and the residents of the South and West, reduced absenteeism in U.S. industry, increased individual bank savings, and a vast increase in organized crime and gangsterism. The most spectacular example of lawlessness and gangsterism in the 1920s was Chicago. Besides controlling the illegal liquor industry, American gangsters in the 1920s earned rich profits from prostitution, gambling, labor racketeering, and illegal drugs. The top gangster, Al Capone, was finally convicted and sent to prison for the crime of income tax evasion. This is part of the Untouchables, which is a movie with Kevin Costner and Sean Connery, in that basically describes Chicago in the 1920s. Another issue that comes to the forefront in American culture in the 1920s is evolution. The trial of John Scopes in 1925 centered on the issue of teaching evolution in public schools. The essential issue in the Scopes trial was whether the Darwinian evolutionary science could be taught in public schools. The state of Tennessee had a law banning the teaching of that theory in high schools. So the immediate outcome of the 1925 Scopes trial was that biology teacher John Scopes was found guilty of teaching evolution, but he will only pay a fine because a problem was found with his sentence. But one of the key features of the Scopes monkey trial is fundamentalism, and fundamentalist religion will remain vibrant forces in American spiritual life, much like it does today. In the 1920s, most American artists and intellectuals were disillusioned by the futile slaughter of World War I and by the anti-intellectualism of American society. T.S. Eliot, an American who became a British citizen, who expressed in his poem The Wasteland his despair over the fragmentation of post-war civilization, best stated the characteristics of, quote, the lost generation of American intellectuals in the 1920s. The leading cultural critic of the 1920s was H.L. Mencken, who attacked the South, patriotism, democracy, and Puritanism. And two of the great American writers of the 1920s will be Ernest Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald. And many of the prominent new writers of the 1920s were highly critical of traditional American Puritanism and small-town life. During the 1920s, the center of African American literary and cultural revival of the 1920s was Harlem in New York City. The Harlem Renaissance can best be described as a celebration of black culture and creative expression of a prominent and vibrant black community in the North. The Harlem Renaissance was led by a creative group of young writers and artists who broke with the older genteel traditions of black literature to reclaim a cultural identity with African roots. But many of the African American writers and artists of the Harlem Renaissance felt ambivalent about the dependence on white patronage for support and access to publicating their works. Signals abounded that the economic boom might end in a crash. Even in the best years of the 1920s, several hundred banks failed annually. Speculation ran wild, and an orgy of boom or bust trading pushed the market up to unseen heights to unseen before heights. The bull market of the 1920s occurred because margin accounts allowed investors to buy with borrowed money, expecting the price of the stocks to go up. Corporations put capital into stocks rather than research and wages of their worker, increasing the wages of their workers. The climate of opinion indicated everyone was meant to get rich, and Andrew Mellon's tax policies reduced the tax burden of the wealthy who now use this extra money to speculate in the stock market. The U.S. government did make one business-like move towards economic sanity in 1921 when the Republican Congress created the Bureau of the Budget. The Bureau's director would aid the president in preparing careful estimates of revenues and spending for submission to Congress as the annual budget. Burdensome taxes inherited from the war were especially distasteful to the Secretary of Treasury, Andrew Mellon, as well as his fellow millionaires. As a result, Mellon engineered through Congress a series of drastic tax reductions. In 1921, a wealthy person with an income of $1 million had paid $663,000 in income tax. But by 1926, thanks to Mellon's reforms, the same person paid only $200,000, which meant that now they have $463,000 in extra income. And the majority of the wealthy use this newly found income to speculate in the stock market. So during the 1920s, Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon and the Republican Congress pursued the economic policy of cutting taxes for the wealthy and shifting the tax burden to the middle class, where it still rests today. But Mellon's tax policies did reduce the national debt $10 million from $26 to $16 billion. Warren Harding. Weakness as president was he had a mediocre mind, was unable to detect moral weakness in his associates, was unwilling to hurt people's feelings by saying no, and had no administrative abilities. As president, Warren G. Harding proved to be a weak-willed and tolerant of corruption among his friends. The relationship between government and big business advocated by the Republican presidents of the 1920s was that government should keep hands off the business and actively promote laissez-faire, which means leave alone. And the general policy of the federal government towards industry in the 1920s was a weakening of federal regulation and an encouragement of trade associations and oligopolies. Republican economic activities policies under Warren G. Harding hoped to encourage government to actively guide business along the path to profits. During the 1920s, the Supreme Court often ruled against progressive legislation. Two groups who suffered severe political setbacks in the immediate post-World War environment were organized labor and blacks. In the Atkins versus Children's Hospital case of 1923, the Supreme Court ruled that women were no longer entitled to special protection in the workplace because they now had the right to vote. The great event that essentially crippled organized labor during the 1920s was the federal government's anti-labor intervention that broke the 1919 steel strike. Veterans organizations like the American Legion successfully lobbied Congress to give them a bonus insurance policy to compensate them for lost wages during their military service. Two terms that describe the Harding and Coolidge administration's approach to foreign policy are isolationism and disarmament. The primary reason that Harding was willing to seize the initiative on the issue of international disarmament was that business people were unwilling to help pay for a larger U.S. Navy. So in 1921-1922, at the Washington Congress, the major signatories agreed to limit the size of their navies and maintain the status quo in the Pacific. The proposed ratio of 553 in the Washington Disarmament Conference of 1921-1922 referred to the allowable ratio of battleships and carriers among the United States, Britain, and Japan. And a few years later, in 1928, over 50 countries in the world will sign the Kellogg-Briand Pact that officially outlawed war as a solution to international rivalry and conflict. But one of the key issues of the 1920s are tariffs. As soon as the World War I is over, the United States will raise its tariff barriers to imported goods from Western Europe, and these very high tariff rates of the 1920s had the primary economic effect of causing the Europeans to erect their own tariff barriers and thus severely reduce international trade. Consequences of the U.S. policy of raising sky-high tariffs in the 1920s were that European nations raised their own tariffs, the post-war chaos in Europe was prolonged, international economic distress deepened, and American foreign trade declined. The Teapot Dome scandal involved Albert Fall, who was the Secretary of Interior from the newly admitted state of New Mexico. It centered around corrupt deals and bribes involving naval oil reserves in Wyoming and in California. The central scandal of the Teapot Dome involved members of Harding's cabinet who took bribes for leasing federal oil lands. That was Albert B. Fall. Harding will hear of these scandals as he returns from a trip to Alaska and the far west, and he will die of thrombosis in 1922, 1923, and many think he died of a broken heart. The chief virtue of his successor, Calvin Coolidge, was his image of unimpeachable morality, which disassociated him from the scandals of the Harding administration. His honesty, his frugality, his shyness, and caution all distanced him from Harding and his presidency's scandals. During Coolidge's presidency, government policy was set largely by the interests and values of the business community. One of the major problems facing farmers in the 1920s was overproduction. And with the advent of the gasoline-powered tractor in the 1920s, this meant that productivity went way up, but so did debt. One major group that experienced hard economic times amidst the general prosperity of the 1920s was farmers. American culture was in chronic trouble during the 1920s because after 1920, European countries no longer needed American farm products because they began to resume normal agricultural production. And in response to lower prices, American farmers only broke out more and more new land because they could with the new gasoline-powered tractor. The McNary-Halligan bill, passed by Congress and twice vetoed by President, aimed to assist American farmers by having the federal government buy farm surpluses and sell them abroad. So the farm bloc's favorite solution to the severe drop in prices that caused farmers' economic suffering in the 1920s was for the federal government to buy up agricultural surpluses at higher prices and sell them abroad. But the reality is, with high tariff barriers erected by the United States, the European countries will respond in kind, so there's nowhere to sell American surplus grain overseas. In 1924, Coolidge will run in his own right as for the presidency, but the Democratic Party was badly split into several factions. One split was wets versus dries, another was immigrants versus old stock Americans, fundamentalists versus modernists, and northern liberals versus southern conservatives. Besides deep divisions within the Democratic Party, the election of 1924 revealed that the progressive movement led by Robert La Follette of Wisconsin was much weaker than it had been before World War I, and why the Progressive Party did not do well in 1924 was because too many people shared in the general prosperity of the time to care about reform. America's European allies argued, this is France and Britain, that they should not have to repay loans that the U.S. made to them during World War I because they had paid a much heavier price and lost lives, so it was only fair for the United States to write off the debt. But as a result of America's assistance that its allies, France and Britain, that its allies' war debts be repaid in full, the French and British demanded enormous reparation payments from Germany. And one important reason why European nations were slow in repaying their wartime debts to the United States was because they could only earn the money to repay their debts by increasing exports to the United States, which was keeping out foreign goods through high protective tariffs. So the international economic crisis caused by unpaid war reparations and loans was partially resolved by private American bank loans to Germany that enabled Germany to pay war reparations. This is called the Dawes Plan. Under the Dawes Plan of 1924, Germany's reparations were reduced and the United States lent substantial sums to Germany so that it could pay some reparation to the Allies, who could then repay their debts to the U.S. If you look at this chart, the chief risk inherent in the international financial system created by the Dawes Plan, it all begins with loans from Wall Street bankers and other private banks, is that if the flow of capital from the U.S. to Europe were cut off, the world financial system would collapse. And this will happen in late 1925 after the collapse of the stock market in October 1929. In the political liabilities of Alfred Smith, who was the Democratic nominee for president in 1928, was his Catholic religion, his support for the repeal of prohibition, his big city background, and his radio speaking skill, which was more a shrill than a voice. His opponent will be Herbert Hoover, who when elected in 1928 was a millionaire. His chief strengths as a presidential candidate was his talent for administration. So in the political campaign of 1928, Herbert Hoover revealed himself as a combination of 19th century small-town virtues with big business efficiency. And when elected to the presidency in 1928, Hoover combined small-town values with wide experience in more modern corporate America. And the election of Hoover over Smith in 1928 seemed to represent a victory of big business and efficiency over urban and Catholic values. The Federal Farm Board, created by the Agricultural Marketing Act, lent money to farmers primarily to help them to organize producers' cooperatives. Also in 1930, for some reason, without any logic, the Congress will pass the sky-high Hawley-Smoot tariff that had the economic effect of crippling international trade and deepening the Depression. And as a result of the Hawley-Smoot tariff of 1930, the worldwide depression deepened. An economic downturn began slowly in 1927 inside the United States, but the economy was not recognized as being in recession until the summer of 1929. One important cause of the great stock market crash in 1929 was overexpansion of production and credit beyond the ability to pay for them. So domestic overexpansion of production and dried up international trade helped cause the stock market crash and deepen the Great Depression. Consequences of the stock market crash of October 29, 1929 was that banks began to fail and depositors' money was lost. Speculators who had lost in the stock market could not repay their bank loans, and many of the middle class who had not speculated in the stock market lost their life savings in bank failures. So the impact of the Great Depression on Americans resulted in jobless husbands feeling guilt and shame for their families' hardships, Thousands of banks collapsed, taking with them people's life savings who had not invested in the stock market or speculated in the stock market. Bread lines and soup kitchens will emerge to feed the hungry, and thousands of people lost their homes to foreclosure. Causes of the Great Depression included agricultural overproduction and debt, unequal distribution of wealth, overextension of credit, a weak foreign trade, and economic troubles in Europe. Hoover's approach to the Great Depression was to offer federal assistance to businesses and banks, but not individuals. The term Hoovervilles refers to shanty towns filled with shacks created by homeless people during the Great Depression. Hoover supported the anti-depression measures of federal government loans to banks, corporations, and local governments, and federally financed public works projects. Even though Hoover was criticized for his handling of the Great Depression, some historians consider this unfair because his measures probably prevented a more serious collapse than the one that occurred. His expenditures for relief were revolutionary in that day. His government programs paved the way for the massive spending programs of the New Deal, and his handling of the crisis proved that old notions of programs could no longer work in a major crisis. Congress will pass an act establishing the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, who was to make loans to businesses, banks, and state and local governments. And the reality was this was an attempt at trickle-down economics, in that money would be given to businesses, banks, and federal and state governments at the top, and slowly that money would trickle down to individual Americans. The significance of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation was that it marked a watershed in American political history because with it, a president for the first time turned to federal action to stimulate the economy after voluntary cooperation had failed. Hoover's limited efforts at federally sponsored relief and recovery failed to end the Depression, but did prevent more serious economic suffering. When President Hoover was urged to support a federal relief program for the unemployed, he persisted in holding that private charity, not federal aid, was the American way. In 1932, because of growing economic misery, hundreds of World War I veterans will descend upon Washington during the summer of 1932, and they will be called the Bonus Expeditionary Force. And they will come to Washington to demand immediate full payment of the bonus payments promised to them by Congress after World War I. But the reality is they are not due those bonuses until 1945. Hoover's public image was severely damaged by his use of military force to disperse the bonus army from Washington, D.C. In America, the Great Depression caused a decade-long decline in the birth rate. During the Great Depression, the majority of families in the United States had to make do, but did not face sheer deprivation. Most typically, Americans who had lost income during the Great Depression reacted by blaming themselves. Individual or group responses to the Great Depression were that many people felt that maintaining their self-respect by keeping up appearances was the best way to cope with hardship. The majority of married women during the Depression years felt an increasing importance on their role as they struggled to keep their families afloat. Because their jobs are low paying, almost all of them will keep their job. And many middle-income American households in the 1930s typically changed their consumption patterns by buying fewer new clothes and using the telephone less. And many families stretched their income by means of installment buying. During the Great Depression, the proportion of students who stayed in high school rose substantially because boys who traditionally tended to drop out to take jobs now could not find work. And even at the greatest depths of the Great Depression, the majority of Americans saw at least one movie a week. American movies during the 1920s presented traditional values such as democracy and individualism. And in the winter of 1932 to 1933, between FDR's election and his inauguration, the Depression will plunge to its lowest depth.